It's Friday, September 6th in 2024, and we welcome you once again to our Chapter 49 podcast. Chapter 49 represents most IRS employees in the state of Indiana. My name is Larry Lannan. I'm a volunteer doing all things communication for Chapter 49. And we're so happy you've chosen to join us, taking a little bit of your time to spend 30 minutes or so with myself and our chapter president, Duncan Giles. Welcome back, Duncan.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here, especially since the fire alarm drill just stopped.
Well, you did mention that, and I don't recommend everybody do this, but Duncan does have a policy of when the fire alarm goes off, he just doesn't leave. I wouldn't recommend everybody do that.
No, usually, though, it is either A, a drill, or B, because of all the construction we have in this building, someone has either cut a circuit or cut something in particular. In this case, because it was so short, I'm sure it was a circuit that was quickly restored.
And Duncan Giles is so devoted to this podcast because he has a very busy day. So we're actually recording a little earlier than usual today. If we don't get it done now, we don't get it done today. So Duncan, you are certainly dedicated to this podcast. That's all I can say.
Yeah, it's one of those things you go away for a few days or just have a few days off, come back, and everybody's loaded up your Friday with meetings that you didn't even know you had.
Well, yeah, that particularly happened to me when I was a manager, but I would guess chapter presidents are the same way. They just fill your calendar up without even telling you.
Yeah.
You have a conflict, tough. You just have to do this. Here's the meeting, go. So I guess it does happen that way. I want to thank everybody for the birthday wishes. I can't believe I made it to age 73. I had a birthday a few years of life. I had a birthday a few days ago, and I appreciate all the happy birthday wishes. Duncan, you and your wife did that. I appreciate it. And I'm still amazed I've made it to age 73. So thanks to everybody. If we can now move on, it's really sad how often we've been doing this podcast for more than 4 years now. How many times have we dealt with the government shutdown? How many times have we talked about government shutdowns? We thought we would avoid that because it's an election year. Well, now the minority leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, did post a social media message. I think it was yesterday, Thursday, the day before we record this, or a day or two before we record this. And he basically said that it's his understanding that the Republican presidential nominee has told his fellow Republicans in the House that they should create a government shutdown. That's right, create a government shutdown right before the election. Now, my understanding was the leadership in Congress of both parties were trying their best to avoid that, as was the president. Well, now we have a new iron in the fire with at least one presidential candidate saying that he just as soon have a government shutdown right before the election because our fiscal year ends at the end of September. October 1 is right smack dab in the middle of the main campaign season. So, Duncan, you've looked at this, you've read about it just like I have. Do you think we have a genuine danger of having a government shutdown October 1st?
Larry, I'm one of those, as you know, and as people who have followed this podcast for any length of time know, I'm one that always is very concerned when these types of things come up. You see things like, well, the House has passed their appropriations bills. Yes, they have. The House has passed the majority of their appropriations bill. However, they've passed them with extremely draconian cuts that would cost the careers of several thousand government employees, if not tens of thousands. That the Senate has worked on some of theirs in a more bipartisan fashion to try and get things done, but they haven't passed them out of committee. So now what we're left with right now, Congress is not in session this week. As you said, the end of this month, the money runs out, and we're hoping for a continuing resolution. That means a CR, which means, in most years, it means, okay, we'll go ahead with a predetermined amount of time. pass this bill for funding at current levels. Well, there are certain parties and people in parties that want to put riders on this, and a rider is something that's not really attached to the continuing resolution at the start, but they want to add it to this to make certain conditions, certain political positions, firm, things of that nature. And it just usually, the vast majority, doesn't matter which party, if you add riders onto a continuing resolution, unless it's something for like disaster relief, it doesn't go well. And both the Senate and the president have said there should not be any riders on a continuing resolution. Then we get into how long is the continuing resolution going to be? The vast majority want it to be going through December, so a lame duck Congress, not having to worry about election pressure, can go ahead and pass reasonable bills. But there are others that say, no, we want to go this until March or April of 2025 with these draconian cuts. So I think that there's a wide variance. I'm always hopeful that there's an 11th hour of sanity that will break out, but I don't know if that'll occur this time.
This idea of riders, I think that's an interesting point. And the problem with riders, another part of that, is that it becomes an escalation. So the Republicans say, I want this rider. Democrats say, well, fine, then we want this rider. Neither party wants each other's rider. And so they have a term they use in Congress, and it's a weird term, a clean CR. It doesn't mean it's shiny and it's clean in the general sense. It simply means that, as you mentioned, it's just going to continue the resolution, continue everybody's budgets at the previous year's level for a certain period of time. That's a clean CR. It doesn't have anything else on it, no other provisions on it. So we're in the silly season now. I had always thought that cooler heads would prevail, and I do think even the Speaker of the House is a fairly conservative man, understands the political realities. It's been explained to him by the pollsters and the people who advise him that a government shutdown right before an election is bad for everybody, whichever party forces it. So that was always my understanding, that would be the final way that there would be some kind of continuing resolution. But then you put in a presidential candidate who thinks it's in his interest. I kind of gave away which one it is. Sorry. In his interest to force a government shutdown, even though maybe the people in the Congress don't. You're in a very almost uncharted territory. We don't know how this will end. And so when people ask you, Duncan, should I plan for a government shutdown or not? What should you tell those employees?
I always tell them everybody should have an emergency reserve in case something comes up. And this is one of those something that comes up, because everybody will get paid. Congress, a few shutdowns ago, did make that a federal law that employees would eventually be made whole if there was a shutdown that occurred that cost them any days off that they would be working. So they would be made whole on that. But like we had the 35-day shutdown a few years ago, several years ago, it's tough to go to the grocery store and say, hey, look, I'm going to get paid. Can you hold off on charging me until this is over? Or, hey, whoever holds my mortgage, can you hold off on doing, me paying this and not accrue any penalty or interest on it until then? And that's extremely difficult to do. And we don't want to have anybody have to be put into that position. That's why a clean CR makes the most sense, because people say, well, can they still pass the appropriations bill? And I can say with absolute certainty that no, it's not happening. They're not passing the appropriations bills to go through one house, go to the other, be in agreement, and or go to what's called a conference committee if there's a disagreement, and then be signed by the president. With where they are right now, there is no way that that's happening. The only thing that we're going to be looking for is a continuing resolution, and we hope that as you said, cooler heads will prevail, and sanity will reign, but we just don't know because of political pressures. And like you said, this is not a political winner for anyone when a government shutdown occurs. Services could be either delayed or denied because of this. American people, elect Congress to pass, legislation and basically pass budgets. And when they see Congress can't do their job, that doesn't make them very happy. So it's not a popular thing to do. And doing it in front of an election, especially one where the country is this divided, is going to be extremely, to me, ill thought out. But we'll just have to wait and see how this progresses.
Well, we certainly hope there is no government shutdown, but if we are in danger of that, go to our Facebook page. You can go to Facebook and search under NTEU Chapter 49 Indiana. You can follow or like our page. We've got about 100 people who read it regularly, so you're welcome to be part of that group if you wish to do so. We try to keep you up to date. And if you have registered as a member on the NTU.org system, you'll be receiving emails from the National Union as well. So we're NTU in many different ways. We'll try to keep you as up to date as possible. We hope it's not an issue. But Duncan, if there's a 6-month continuing resolution, and I think that's what's being discussed right now, it will be the next Congress that will make this decision, not the one that's in place right now. So it would be an after the election decision in that case. That would be kicking the can to the next Congress, just so people understand what's going on there. Anything on that before we move on?
Yeah, next Congress and next administration. And that's what they're looking at, because there can be, there are widely varying degrees of what government should do and how government should be run between the two political parties and the two folks running for president.
Well, let's talk about 2025 in another way, the federal employee raise for 2025. You and I, Duncan, discussed in our last podcast how there were rumors out there that Joe Biden, being a good friend of the federal workforce and through his entire elective office career, was maybe going to do a last-minute recommendation to increase that average 2% pay raise for federal employees. Well, we got the answer not too long after we recorded that podcast. Joe Biden made an official communication to the Congress that he wants an overall 2% pay raise. 0.3% of that will go to locality. It looks like it's a done deal now. There's always a possibility of a last-minute congressional change. It just doesn't look very good the way things are moving at the moment. What's your view on this?
Yeah, we were both really hoping, and I'm sure thousands, if not millions, were hoping that there would be, pay parity with the military, and to increase the pay raise, because inflation has been more than 2%. But the president did come down and say, okay, everybody gets 1.7, and as you said, 0.3% for locality pay. And unless Congress takes action and votes for a larger raise for federal employees, which some in Congress are trying to do, there are bills out there. So NTU.org has a great way to reach out to your representatives or senators, not on government time, not on government property, and not using government equipment, but you can sit there and send them a quick email basically asking them for a higher raise for at least pay parity with the military. But outside of that, it does look like it's going to be the 2%. And I'm disappointed. I understand the rationale, which is, they think the budgets are not going to be much increased, if at all, and they were afraid that if there was a larger raise, that would preclude things like hiring, training, and things of that nature, because the budgets are so tight. So I understand the rationale, but I still think that there should have been a way to at least get pay parity for us with the military for a higher raise. But the president didn't see it that way. The administration did not see it that way. And so we'll just have to see if Congress can pull out a Hail Mary and help us out. If not, then we'll be looking at that 2% raise overall come January 1st.
Yeah, locality pay only being 0.3%. Actually, in Indiana, just speaking for us in Indiana for a moment, we only have 2 locality areas, one the Indianapolis metro area, and then our Maryville office is tied into Chicago. The rest of our offices in Indiana are rest of the U.S. And when you're rest of the U.S., the more that goes to locality pay, the less you get benefit from that. pay increase. So we just have to understand there's always going to be some aspect of locality pay in there. And we didn't know this until the president made his final communication to the Congress that he was going to allocate 0.3% of that 2% to locality pay, which is pretty much in line with what's been done in the past. Any comment before we move on about the pay raise for next year?
Nope, just hope that Congress can do something with it, but I would not count on it. I'd count on that 2%, the 1.7 at least for the base, and then the 0.3 for different localities.
Let's move on, because voting is we were in the midst of campaigns, presidential campaign. There are lots of state and local elections going on as well throughout the nation. In Indiana, you can still register to vote until early October. I don't have the date in front of me, but we'll talk about that later. The reason I mention that is that as soon as registration ends, early voting begins in Indiana, and it depends on where you live as to what kind of early voting might be available to you. And I know there are many places where people listen to this podcast or watch it where there is going to be early voting. But first of all, make sure you're registered to vote. Go online and do that very easily. You don't know how, check in Indiana with Duncan, check with your local chapter. There are very easy online ways to verify you are registered, that you have your current address on there. And if not, you can get that changed. So first of all, make sure you're registered. And then once registration is closed, usually shortly after that, in most localities, if there is early voting available, it starts right about that time. So, Duncan, what I would like to go over now, even though in Indiana, we're about a month away from early voting or so, and we don't know when early voting will begin in other places where people may be watching and listening. What I really want to focus in on now is not so much that, as once early voting begins, explain how our contract and regulations federally and laws federally govern your ability to, as a federal employee, take official time to go and cast your vote either early or on election day.
Absolutely, Larry. Yeah, that's one of the things. I'm a huge advocate of voting. You know, I don't. I vote certain ways. You vote certain ways. Everybody votes a different way, but I am a huge believer in, please make your voice heard. Get out there and vote. And as the federal government says, OPM says, the Office of Personnel Management, who basically manages all federal agencies or oversees them, make sure your employees have time to vote. In particular, for the IRS, we have expanded in our contract the number of hours that you do get to go to vote. So there should not be any excuse, either early voting or voting on the day of, to make sure that you get out there, do your civic duty, and vote for what works best for you and your family. And make sure that you take advantage of these things. If you have a manager that comes back and says, well, I'm sorry, that's inconvenient, I'm not going to be able to give you any time to vote, or it shouldn't take you that long to vote, or something along those lines, please let your chapter know. If you're in Indiana, please let me know. Shoot me an email. I will be more than happy to discuss this with the manager or their manager's manager to make sure that everybody is clear that they do get time on the clock, administrative time, to vote, because we all feel it's so important for everyone to vote.
This goes all the way back to the early 1990s. I got to tell you a story. I don't know if I've ever even told you this story, Duncan, but I do remember when George Bilkey was our chapter president in those days. There was one management official who just declared that this person was not going to approve any early voting. It wasn't quite as liberal then, but we still had the ability to vote on election day in those days, taking time off of work to do that. And she just declared that she just wasn't going to let anybody take time off to vote. So George, being the fairly direct person he always was, and you knew George a little bit, I knew him pretty well, he just let that management official know that if that person stayed with that on election day, he was going to call every media outlet in town and have a news conference in front of that office and explain how they were violating the law and not letting their employees vote. After that conversation, everybody got their official time to vote, just so everybody knows.
Isn't that amazing how that works?
But George never put up with that stuff. If he thought, and I don't think you were that way either, but he just had a different style of doing things. He was a very direct guy, but that's I think that point I'm trying to make there is NTE, going back as far as I can remember being involved with this union, has always considered the right to vote and official time to vote a very, very important part of what we do to represent uh, our people in our bargaining unit, and also just to make sure people have the ability to vote. And there's really no excuse not to go out and vote as long as you are able to get to the polls. So that's my story. And yes, registration, make sure you're registered, and then make sure you get a chance to vote, either early vote or on election day. Anything you want to add before we move on that issue?
No, I just, I think that you and I are in absolute lockstep in thinking that, there isn't any excuse to not vote. Every election is important. This election is important. From president on down to, local councilors who are going to make laws in your area or rules in your area. So I wholeheartedly think that everybody should vote to make their voices heard.
I don't know about you, Duncan, but I can think back as far back as I can remember, just following national politics and government. I don't think I could count the number of government efficiency groups that have been formed by the president, the Congress, you name it, official bodies looking at government efficiency. I looked in the news the other day, and there's a particular presidential candidate who's already said this candidate is going to form a government efficiency committee. And trust me, anytime there's a government efficiency committee, it's going to impact federal employees in some way. Has said that that particular candidate would choose as the chair of that body Elon Musk, the man who gave us Twitter transformed to X. I don't know, Duncan, what are your views on that?
With Mr. Musk's past history of how he's dealt with his employees, i.e., wanting them to sleep on sleeping bags in their offices, and if they're not willing to do that, terminating them with no issue whatsoever. Work-life balance, I don't know, is something that he truly understands. And, that's one of those things where that's part of, what the federal government does it should be ensuring that you have a good work-life balance. Should you be working your 40 hours a week if you're working a full time? Absolutely. You should be there. You should be doing the work. You should be doing that. But when you're off and you're not on the clock, you shouldn't have to worry about, okay, I need to catch up on these cases. I need to do this. I need to do that, and do what I like to call love time. There shouldn't be any of that going on. And I'm afraid with someone like Mr. Musk in charge of this, that would be expected to be the norm rather than something to be abhorred. And that's just the wrong way to go, in my opinion.
Well, we promised a while back that we would have a Hatch Act provision or discussion in every podcast up through Election Day. So we do want to talk about another aspect of making sure you're complying with the Hatch Act. And it relates, of all things, to your attire, what you wear on your body. Why should you care about that? And why should that impact you, whether or not you are, in fact, complying with the Hatch Act?
Yeah, remember that you cannot advocate for any particular, you can't party, individual, anything of that nature while you're on government property and on government time. And we've already had cases here in Indiana, and I'm sure my brethren have dealt with this across the country, where people are coming in wearing hats, wearing buttons, or even wearing shirts espousing a particular candidate. And we've had to tell people that you either need to go home on your own time or turn your shirt inside out while you're here so it doesn't show that. Otherwise, you are going to be subject to possible Hatch Act penalties. It wouldn't be us enforcing it, it would be management, but they'd be well within their rights if somebody saw a t-shirts saying, you should vote for this, or, I'm in favor of this particular person and vote for them and only them, or something disparaging about another candidate that's clearly a pro vote for someone else. So you can't do anything like that on government time, government property. If you want to wear a shirt, a button, a hat, anytime that you're out in the public, that you're out to dinner, anything of that nature, that's fine. As long as you're not on government time and government property, you're okay to express that opinion. Facebook, whatever social media you want to do, you can put your opinion out there, but don't do it on government property and on government time with any piece of attire that you have. That is just not going to go well for anybody, and we want to try and stop a problem before it begins. So please do not do that.
I can just imagine the next question somebody's going to ask you, Duncan, is, okay, I'm working telework. Nobody can see me. Well, if that's the case, you better not be on a teleconference, better not be on a video conference, because if a management person sees you on a video conference wearing something that would violate the Hatch Act, they're going to come after you.
Absolutely correct. And that's, well, I don't have to turn on my camera. Well, in a lot of instances, yes, you are required to turn on your camera. There's some that are not, but if your manager says, okay, I want to have a one-on-one to discuss something, and they ask you to turn on their camera, your camera, yes, they are within their rights for that. If it would be something they would be doing in person, and they see you wearing something that does violate the Hatch Act, they're not going to have any choice but to write you up for that. So we don't want to see, like I said, we don't want to see anybody have that. I want everybody to have strong convictions. I may not agree. I may be 100% opposed to what you're voting for, what you want, or what you think. But by God, away from the federal government property and on the clock, you have the right to espouse that. That's the freedom of speech. But just don't do it. It's not even worth testing, toying with, anything of that nature. So if you're teleworking, please do not be having that, wearing it or anything of that nature. It's just not the right thing to do, and it could get you in some very serious trouble.
Hey, Duncan, time for your final comment.
My final comment today is, again, something I've espoused many times on this podcast, and I will continue to do so, is, make sure that you take care of your mental health as well as your physical health. We've had instances where folks have had issues, and they seem to feel that, it's on them or something of that nature because they're having a mental issue. Most of the time that's a chemical imbalance in your brain, and to go to a mental health professional to try and get that corrected is the right thing to do. And it would be the same thing as you're doing if you have a problem with the rest of your body, with the physical as opposed to the mental. So again, please make sure that you take care of that. If you need to, contact a mental health counselor, we have programs for that you can get a couple of free ones. But it's never hurts to talk to a counselor to make sure that your mental health. We all have stressful jobs here at the IRS. I know this is going to shock a lot of you, but we're not a well-loved organization for the most part. So that is a lot of stress in and of itself. And we want to make sure that, you're taken care of as much as possible.
Well, Duncan, here's my final comment. And I'm sorry, I just can't be serious all the time. Fine. I had a fellow I knew, he still lives here for the most part. He moved to Fishers, Indiana, where I live, from Los Angeles, California. He always complained about the cost of living in LA, which I'm sure is true. And it was a cold and windy and snowy day once, and I saw him. I said, well, don't you wish you were back in Los Angeles? And he gave me a 30-minute speech on why he didn't care about the winter weather. He really did not want to go back to LA and deal with the cost of living. I thought about him when I saw this story on the Associated Press wire, because of the cost of just living, just cost of housing, for example, in Los Angeles, in Southern California. They now have half a house for $500,000. What do we mean? There was a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom bungalow in a place called Monrovia, suburban LA. It was crushed by a tree back in May. There were 2 renters and 2 dogs inside. Nobody was hurt. Everybody got outside of the building fine. But a fence and most of the roof were just totally mangled by this tree. So what's left of the property with the missing walls, the hanging wires, no ceilings, there's a realtor trying to sell this property for $500,000, because I guess it was worth $1 million when it was before the tree hit it. And the real estate agent told the LA Times it's what he called an open concept floor plan. So as much as I like nice weather, I think I'm going to stay away from Los Angeles as a place to live. And for those of you who live out there, God bless you. I'm glad you're able to handle that. I'm sure a lot of people like living in the LA area. I'm just not sure I could afford to do it. And Duncan Giles, thank you very much once again for joining us on the Chapter 49 podcast. Chapter 49 represents most IRS employees in the state of Indiana. And we do very much appreciate the fact that you are watching or listening to this podcast. You've given us about 30 minutes or so of your time. And we try to have this podcast every week to the extent we can. We don't make it every week, but we do make it most weeks during the year. So once again, if you like the podcast, subscribe on YouTube or on whatever platform you are listening, if you're listening to this on the audio version. My name is Larry Lannan for Duncan Giles. Thank you again for being here. Please be safe and be kind.